Good morning. Brought along a reading which I would like to start out with before the sermon. It's called It All Comes Back, and it's by Galway Kinnell. We placed the cake with its 4 candles poking out of thick, soft frosting. We placed the cake on the seat of his chair at the head of the table for just a moment while we unfolded and spread a Spanish cloth over Vermont maple. And suddenly he stepped from the group of schoolmates and parents and family friends and ran to the table. And just as someone cried, "No, no, don't sit," he sat on his chair and his cake. And the room broke into groans and guffaws. Actually, it was pretty funny. We all started yelping our heads off. And actually, it wasn't in the least funny. He ran to me, and I picked him up. But I was still laughing. And in indignant fury, he jabbed his thumbs into the corners of my mouth and grasped my cheeks and yanked. He was so muscled and outraged, I felt he might rip my whole face off. And then I realized that was exactly what he was trying to do. And it came to me. I was one of his keepers. His birth and the birth of his sister had put me on the earth a second time, with the promise this time to protect them and to help them love themselves. And yet here I was, locked in solidarity with these other adults against my own child. He hawing away without once wondering if we weren't underneath all of us striking back too late at our own parents for humiliating us. I gulped down my laughter and held him and apologized and commiserated and explained, and then things were right again. But to this day, it remains loose, this face, seat of superior smiles on the bones from that hard yanking. Shall I publish this anecdote from the past and risk embarrassing him? I like it that he fought back. But what's the good? Now he's 36. What's the good in telling this tale of his mortification when he was 4? Let him decide. So I'll give him 3 choices. He can scratch his slapdash check mark, whose rakish look reminds me of his old high school hockey stick. He can place that in whatever box applies. Tear it up, the first option. Don't publish it, but give me a copy, the second. Or third, okay, publish it on the chance that somewhere someone survives of those said to die miserably every day for lack of the small clarification that is sometimes found in a poem. Some sermons, I understand, are not applicable in equal measure to every person sitting in a congregation on any given day. A sermon on, let's say, the midlife crisis is futuristic science fiction to the millennials among us, and old news to the chronologically gifted. A sermon on creativity will never speak to those who prefer the world to be always neat and predictable and drawn within the lines. A sermon on the spirituality of silence will irk the introverts among us to no end. But a sermon on broken promises, well, only the delusional exclude themselves from the company that share this bond, this inevitable human burden. Apart from times I have preached on forgiveness, as I was working on this, I don't know if there's any sermon topic that reaches such a universal yet personal place in all of us. All, as in everyone, no exceptions. Every one of us, I think, every single one of us could take an inventory of our own promises that we have made and broken. And there are some that are large, and there are some that are small, and there are some we regret every single day, and there are some that we may barely remember. And some we try after a fashion to repair. And others we just find ways to live with. A few days ago, I opened this subject of broken promises to my random and far-flung roster of Facebook friends. It's become the preacher's friend when it comes to finding inspiration and insight from others to help broaden our experience of this life, which, of course, we have but one path to walk. So I invited whoever was looking at it that day to tell me about their own experience with this burden of broken promises. And I was nothing less than blown away by what people shared. I felt sort of like I had established a virtual confession booth online as I scrolled down through stories that would break your heart. That is, if your own experiences hadn't somehow done the job already. Someone told me about a promise made and broken to an elderly parent who wanted assurances that at the end of their life, their child would help them to die. A mom told me about a promise that was made and broken to a child when she gave up her custody of that child and moved across the country. A colleague wrote to me about a promise that was made and broken to keep a confidence that she realized she was morally unable to bear. And a woman recalled still a promise made and broken to write her boyfriend who went and died in Vietnam. A promise she still holds. I tell you, I wasn't really prepared for what came from this offhand Facebook inquiry I made. Of course, I expected to hear about the broken promises that are attendant to marriages and romantic relationships. And I did hear of them. But perhaps what struck me most deeply was the residual effect of breaking even a promise of almost seeming insignificance. Like the promise that was in that poem I shared a little while ago, that the father felt he had broken in not protecting his child from humiliation. In sorting through the narratives of the stories that people freely shared with me, always with the assurance of their anonymity, I found that most of the stories and promises were defined by these characteristics. They either seemed to be promises that were made to other people, but there also were many promises that were made by people to themselves. And on the other hand, some of the promises were either explicit, such as that one that includes the phrase, "till death do us part," or they were implicit, such as the ones we make to our children and our pets and other creatures we have responsibility for in this world. Every promise we make involves some pairing of those options, I think. And from what I can tell, the price one pays for a broken promise comes out about even, no matter how explicit it was or who made it. That's a harsh and painful reality that often has a capacity to haunt some of us relentlessly. Guilt. That gift that keeps on giving. So I figured that as long as we were going to live with our broken promises, we might as well find a way to keep what's left of them with some kind of integrity, with some kind of personal, well, I'll call it personal honor. Or at least that's where the sermon is pointed. We are promise-making creatures. To live in society, we count on others around us always to uphold the sorts of promises that society deems somehow conducive to our collective well-being. Things like the promises we make to each other implicitly that we are going to all decide which side of the road we might drive on. The kind of promises that assure freedoms of speech and assembly and religion. And that biggie, that promise about the pursuit of happiness. And a little bit closer in church, we make promises right and left. Both explicit and implicit, to other people and to ourselves. We promise to start at 10 a.m. on Sundays. Not so good on that one. We promise to give something of our money. An explicit promise. We promise implicitly to nurture the children who find their way into this particular place. We promise to be loving and generous and curious and brave and compassionate and patient and forgiving, both implicitly and explicitly to each other and to ourselves in both our word and our deed. And we, you, count on those promises being kept, honored, upheld. And if they happen to be broken, we count on them to be healed and somehow restored. Leaving, of course, the realm where our most tender and fragile promises shape our deepest soul. That inner life that we live and breathe and act in, that we share by accident or intention with that configuration of folks around us that we call lovingly our family. And I do put a quotation mark around the word family. Because these families of ours, however we have configured them, are built, I think, always upon this foundation, this complicated foundation of both explicit and implicit promises that are made to each other. And here I take pain to note that I'm not just talking about the promises that come in the shape of vows. Civil marriage may be opening up for same-sex couples these days, but the general trend for marriage in our culture is actually on the decline. But even so, with or without the blessings of church or state, there's no escaping this essential role that promises make in building secure and nurturing and enduring relationships. You'll note I didn't say permanent relationships. And I'll be coming back to that road hazard before I finish. There's a quote that comes from Thornton Wilder's play, The Skin of Our Teeth, that I have been known to incorporate in wedding ceremonies that speaks to the centrality of promises. Now, it's not the most romantic sentiment, nor the most inspirational chestnut the minister might share at a wedding. But it makes up for all that in its truthfulness. I'll tell you, I've learned not to look at the mother of the bride when I share this reading. Because as a general rule, it makes them all scowly. You'll understand. This is what Wilder has one of his characters say. I didn't marry you because you were perfect. I didn't even marry you because I loved you. I married you because you gave me a promise. The promise made up for all your faults. That's what the mothers don't like. And the promise I gave you made up for mine. Two imperfect people got married, and it was the promise that made the marriage. And when our children were growing up, it wasn't the house that protected them. It wasn't our love that protected them. It was that promise. This is a hard thing for mothers of the bride to hear for one of many reasons. But I've got to tell you, it's not the easiest thing in the world for me to say either. It reminds me of my own broken promises. And most of the time, like you, I'd rather just leave those scars alone. But I carry around a bundle of broken promises. Not as penance, but as a resource and reminder of humility, and as a store of wisdom. I used to imagine that a broken promise was something like a broken dinner plate. It becomes history almost before it hits the floor. You sweep it up and add it to this week's garbage. But a plate and a promise turn out to be a poor comparison. One can't dispose of the latter so neatly. And so what we are left with, the shards and slivers and fragments, actually is the same promise we started with, only broken in 1,000 pieces. And it turns out we keep those pieces, and thus have to figure out some way to keep even the broken promises. It seems that we certainly can break them, but somehow we are never able to unmake them. Maybe that's the hallmark of a genuine promise. In whatever form they are, they endure. We break promises, I think, for as many reasons as we make them. And here I'm not talking about the promise as a bribe, quote unquote. Like when you're driving along with your kids in the car and you speak to them through the rear view mirror and say, if you stop teasing your sister back there, we can get ice cream on the way home. Or the promise that is an oath that we might tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help us, God. I'm actually talking more about the kind of promise that I see as a gift. A pure and simple, no returns, no takebacks, no small print gift. And that's, I think, why they end up lingering, and however many pieces they might end up. Sometimes we make promises we shouldn't have made in the first place. I think of the person who told me about promising a dying parent that they would help them to die. It doesn't really matter what our position politically is on euthanasia when it comes to our own parent. A promise that has such mighty stakes surrounding someone else's life, legal considerations notwithstanding, that's a damn hard promise to keep. I dare say that this is the category where the death do us part promise belongs. Some promises are not kept forever because another promise somehow has trumped them. Another promise somehow has transcended the first one. And here I'm thinking of the way that an implicit promise might take precedence over the explicit ones. I realize this is a great oversimplification, and some might even say a justification for me to say it. But I can't help but think of my own broken promise to the woman I married 30 years ago. My own self-understanding and self-acceptance of myself as a gay man brought me to the place of having to break what was an explicit promise to her. And I didn't always get it right, God knows. But I did my best to keep the implicit promises that came from that union. The kind that the law knows really nothing of. And bless her soul, she kept that side of her promises to me. And then there's another category of broken promises that are the result of what a more judicious person might call poor judgment. But in the vernacular, I'll just put it this way. Those times when we effed up. Been there, done that. And it happens. One of my daughter's very best male friends, a thoughtful, well-grounded, solid kid, got married a couple of summers ago in a celebration that had all the bells and whistles that such an event demands these days. And the week after the honeymoon, the newly minted groom concluded he had made a colossal mistake. Barely made, the promise was on its way to be broken. Now, the Monsignor tried to talk him out of it. Or maybe tried to talk him into it. Whatever. In any case, now it is in the box of broken promises, filed under F for this young man. And someday it may become a funny anecdote that he tells at dinner parties about his 2-week marriage. But knowing this young man, that day will come no time soon. So what does it mean to keep our broken promises? How is it possible? Why should we even bother, you might wonder. And I can't say for sure. I can't say for sure more than I can say how any of us keep unbroken promises. But I have a clue, and I think it's a good clue. And it comes to me through the metaphor I shared earlier of the broken plate and the broken promise. So just for a minute more, bear with me. There's a woman I know who collects fine china. But unlike most people who collect it, She gathers up only broken china. Plates, and saucers, and teacups. And I occasionally take her wounded heirlooms that I find at church rummage sales and estate sales I stumble across. And whenever I arrive at her door holding a box of this broken material, her eyes just light up at the shards of Limoges and the fragments of Haviland and the cracked blue willow teacups. These relics become the raw materials from which she shapes something new, something that is whole, and something that even some days seems perfect. From these broken pieces, she makes mirrors and frames and mosaics and little sculptures. And they're pretty amazing. They're whimsical and evocative and useful and celebratory and bold, but fragile still. In effect, they become the somehow restored. They're restored as something new and whole and complete unto themselves. They are made up, of course, of what they were in the past. That they find new functions and new form and new purpose. New meaning even, once she's done with them. And that, good people, is what I think we can do with our own promises. That's a clue into how to live with those promises of our own. Every last, blessed, and broken one of them. May it be so.
Join hands, clasp a neighbor. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Join us for worship every Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Canandaigua, a welcoming congregation. We are located at 3024 Cooley Road, 4 miles west of South Main Street, Canandaigua, just north of the intersection with Routes 5 and 20. Look for the blue signs just before the turn. Your comments about this program or questions about the church are welcome at 585-396-1370 or at our website, www.canandaiguauu.org. Producer and editor, Daniel Brigham.